Hey, what's up, guys? Britton Frost here for episode 5 of the Overthought and Understated podcast, where I overthink a bunch of stuff and don't nearly say as much as I probably could about it. For one, I don't always take notes with these things. Um, yeah, sorry I haven't been posting much content in the last few months. I have done a few YouTube videos. I've been more active on YouTube, so check out my YouTube channel. But yeah, I've been meaning to do a little more with the podcast, and I just haven't gotten around to it. For one, I've been mostly living with my parents this summer to save money in preparation to move to London to do my master's degree in philosophy under Sir Roger Scruton, who's a prominent thinker on the conservative end of things. I'm really excited to do that. So I've been busy with preparing for that, but also the other reason I guess I haven't been posting much is because I'm lazy as fuck. I'm low in trait conscientiousness from a Big Five perspective, relatively low, like below 50%. Not so low that I just can't do anything ever, but you get the idea. Not using that as an excuse. It's something I'm obviously trying to improve about myself, especially since I'll be way out on my own in a foreign country in about a month from now. So anyway, yeah, this is the new podcast episode, and it's basically the audio from two different YouTube videos that I did about new atheism and uh, about what I think is the nature of religion, and also the connection between new atheism and scientific materialism, and what's common in those belief systems, and how they're actually somewhat one and the same. And so, without any further ado, here are my thoughts on those topics. Hey, what's up? Today, I'm just going to talk a little bit about new atheism and why I think it's stupid. So in my in my video about the second part of the Harris Peterson talk, uh, I had a comment on that video that I should do another video about why I think the new atheists reject God or reject religion on superficial grounds, I think was the terminology I used or he used. Um, and so, obviously in that talk, Peterson and Harris, uh, Peterson describes himself as a deeply religious person, and he's very interested in symbolism and mysticism that comes from religious stories. And Sam Harris is famous, or perhaps infamous, for being one of the new atheists and one of the four horsemen, along with Dawkins, Hitchens, and Dennett. Um, so obviously, they have two totally different conceptions about what religion actually means and what the concept of God is. So they're naturally going to talk past one another, and that's exactly what happened in that talk. Although it was much more civil than their first meeting, um, there was still an ontological roadblock there as far as like coming to some common ground, common understanding of what religion is. What does it mean? What does it help us to do? That sort of thing. And I think those are the questions that Peterson is actually interested in, and that Harris isn't going to explore at all on principle alone. And that's why I would regard Peterson as a much higher and much more worthy of respect public intellectual. And another reason why I can't take someone like Harris seriously is because there are certain questions that he is simply going to avoid, and same is the case with the other new atheists. Anyway, I'm just going to go through a few like very common new atheistic arguments against the existence of God or religion, and I'm just going to, explain why I think those aren't good reasons, or what the fundamental problems are with them. So Richard Dawkins has spoken before of this theistic spectrum from 1 to 7, where someone who's at a 1 is totally religious, believes that God exists, and someone who's at a 7 completely denies or rejects the idea that God exists, and that someone who's right in the middle at a 4 out of 7 is an agnostic and claims that there's like either a 50-50 probability that God exists, or something or the other. So, okay, that's just a quick little Dawkins-ish tidbit. Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens, famous, probably the most famous of the new atheists, and one of the most powerful speakers on the issue. His fundamental idea was that the probability is so low that you shouldn't believe in God. The probability that he exists is so low you shouldn't believe in it. And that it won't help us with objective inquiry. And that's what we should focus on, is rationality and science and stuff. Philosopher John Searle, not as radical an atheist as the others, but certainly I guess an ontological agnostic, we could call him. He would say that the rational person would be agnostic because one can't demonstrate a universal negative, nor can one demonstrate a universal affirmative, right? So you can't be entirely empirically certain of anything. Fair enough. It's hard to accept, also, he says, that it's hard to accept that something we want to believe may not exist, such as that we'll see our deceased friends and family after we die, is like a good example of that. Like, we want that so deeply to be true that many people will believe it, right? Bertrand Russell, philosopher, logician, mathematician from the late 19th, early 20th century. He would say that if he were at the gates for Judgment Day, if it turned out that God did exist, he would be kind of mad at God. He would say, well, you just didn't give us enough evidence, right? So how was I supposed to believe in God? Especially, like, how are we smart people supposed to believe in God, So I think all 4 of these guys, along with people like Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's going to say, oh, I'm an agnostic because, well, show me some evidence. Just show me some evidence. And I think there are videos on YouTube that last like 7 minutes long that basically involve him just repeating that over and over and over again like an insane person, right? So one of the fundamental questions on that note is what constitutes evidence? Well, all 5 of these guys that I've mentioned have the same conception of what evidence is, and that is evidence within the scientific realm. You could call it philosophical materialism. I guess I'll use the words of Rupert Sheldrake, because he put it very neatly, is that scientism, which is a very widespread belief in the academy, scientism is the belief that science already understands the nature of reality, even at its deepest philosophical level, in general or in principle, leaving only the details to be filled in. So if you ask someone who's who subscribes to scientism, or puts scientism above all other belief systems, or the belief in the scientific method, however you want to say it. Is there anything that science can't answer? Any question that science can't answer? They'll say, well, no. There are plenty of things that science doesn't have an answer for now, but eventually science will be able to answer that question, no matter what it is. It could even be a moral question. and that's what the moral realists believe today, is that moral truth is nested inside what we can know empirically and scientifically, right? So what constitutes evidence for these people? Well, someone who believes in scientism, that science as a belief system, is generally going to be a materialist as well. And all of the people who I mentioned on this list are definitely materialists. And I'm not exactly sure how materialism can exist in its purest form, but maybe that's another discussion for another time. But materialism is the belief that reality is comprised of matter. That's it. Any subjective meaning, purpose, anything like that doesn't exist. Now, one problem with this is that, whenever you eliminate the subjectivity from anything, how exactly does that argument not implode on itself? Because what you mean by empiricism, empirical science, is what you can detect through your five senses, what you can experience yourself. You need to be there to hear the tree fall in the forest, to know conclusively that the tree did fall in the forest. So that's like a sort of conceptual problem, I guess, there. And if we ground what we regard as evidence as what can be reduced to our five senses, then, well, our five senses are an intersubjective system. It's something that evolves over millions and millions of years, and it becomes something. Scientific inquiry then becomes something that we cannot separate from the means by which we observe it, right? Our five senses. Okay, so also, all the new atheists really believe that this question of does God exist or not is the fundamentally important question in religion, and whether or not religion should persist as any number of its denominations or ideologies all over the world, any of its interpretations, I guess. But I don't think that the existence of God is really the issue. I think we should be exploring what is God, because a lot of these people they presuppose that they understand what the conception of God is, and God isn't, as far as I can tell, the conception of God exists in some form or another in every single religion. So it's kind of, God is more of an archetype than a person or a thing. And the concept of God certainly isn't grounded in anything material. So it's nothing that you can explore scientifically at all. He's not, or it is not a material entity. So I think the conception of God is, and what it is, what its nature is definitely up for question, and it's unknown, but so the nature of God is unknown. That's very interesting, because what I think God is a representative of the unknown, and I think that on the most specific and the most general level, right? Like God is just that thing that you fear. You fear unknown territory. You fear the road less traveled. You fear going home and dealing with your own demons in your household. Now, like, the scientific method may be extremely important to you in your work, but think about what you know, what's relevant to your life, apart from your career. Scientific questions and the methods are very important at your workplace if you're a scientist, but when you go home, you're going to have to deal with your wife and your kids and confront problems, conceptual problems with your family and your friends and and within yourself. To work through those things, we can understand even some of the details, the technical details about how certain emotions are processed in the brain and things like that. But science isn't going to tell us those where those causes, where the initial causes of those emotional states came from, you know. And usually those things are grounded in some sort of moral decision that you made, rightly or wrongly, you know. And it's why when you you know when you take your free will for granted and you make a wrong moral decision, you lie or you cheat or steal, you know, it eats at you. You made the wrong decision. Something in your moral framework either was disrupted or there was a piece missing somewhere that didn't allow you to make that right moral decision, you know. And you know that's your fault to a very large extent. You know, you can blame it on someone else, but it's no one else's fault. You know, it might be might be due to the circumstances or of your context, your surroundings. But anyway, another thing that the new atheists do when they discuss politics and things is they like to reduce all of the problems of the world down to religion. And everyone likes a simple explanation. I understand that, but they do it with religion specifically. And there are a bunch of deductions that you can make once you decide, okay, the fundamental problem is religion. So what else can we reduce from that? Well, lots of stuff, but it doesn't mean it's right. You know what I mean? So I think they grant religion way too much credit in that regard. But you know, you tend to do that whenever you're, you know, blaming, when you're not, you know, taking responsibility for something yourself, or when you have, you'd prefer to project, you know, the fault of certain undesirable occurrences in the world onto a system. You know, it's easy to attack a system rather than an individual or even a group of individuals, you know. And religion just happens to be that system that's trendy to blame. And that's what New Atheism does a lot of times. So, I guess that's all I'm going to say for now. I guess next video I'll probably talk a little bit about where a moral framework comes from and why atheists can have a good, you know, a decent moral framework without God or religion or some structure like that. But they'll live in ignorance as far as knowing where those structures came from, because they're sort of archetypal in nature. Anyway, yeah, that's it for now. Hey, what's up? This video is a follow-up from my last atheist video where I talked a little bit about New Atheism, probably in a somewhat obtuse fashion. I know I probably could have taken notes and done better on it, but anyway, this is a response to a long comment that Absque Religione posted. I think I'm getting that right. I don't speak Latin, sorry. But there were just a few points that I wanted to pick out of there, some things I wanted to clarify and address in this video. And I guess the first thing I want to say is that, much like pretty much every other atheist response to a video on YouTube, this particular comment was filled with disrespectful ad hominem remarks, and it was quite untactful and just resentful all around, and that's very characteristic of atheists, new atheists in particular. They tend to be thin-skinned and they anger very easily. And one thing about someone who angers very easily is that he's not very confident in his position. He hasn't given sufficient thought to it in order to defend it without insulting someone. Atheists generally can't just attack the content. They have to attack the person, and that's one of the main indicators of ignorance. So maybe that says something about, I'd like to defend atheists sometimes in that I believe they can have a decent moral framework by which to live apart from organized religion. I do think that there are religious substructures at the foundations of our culture that we don't really realize that underlie lots of our actions and our conceptions of good and evil. And you don't have to attribute that to organized religion if you don't want to, but you go far back enough in history, and it did come from some religious group or agreement or some religious system of some sort, and it's archetypal in nature, I would say. But anyway, just want to pick out a few points that were in that comment and clarify those problems, because I think they are general questions that atheists raise. And luckily enough for you and for the other viewers, I'm a reasonable enough guy to not be affected emotionally by your ad hominem remarks. I can pick out the content and separate that from all the shenanigans that was in the comment. So the first thing, I'll get right into it. The first thing was about there was some confusion over the definition of the nature of God. The commenter seemed to be equating the nature of God with nature out there in the woods. Like he said, the nature of God is nature. Okay, fair enough. I can kind of see maybe what you mean by that. But when I say the nature of God, what I mean is the philosophical investigation of God. Philosophy generally explores the nature of things, the fundamental part of its being, its essence, the concept in the raw, so to speak. So now, that's easy to determine if you're a materialist. You understand the nature of anything if you're a materialist, right? Because everything's founded in matter, down to its most fundamental part. That's matter. It's, subatomic particles, I guess. But, the problem with that already is that you delve deeply enough into that realm, things become so crazy and chaotic that literally no one can understand them. And, we can't, we can't magnify our understanding of something down to the level that we would need to like really grasp the meaning of whatever is going on down there is. I don't know if that's clear, but anyway, if materialism is true, if all reality is founded in material stuff and nothing more, and there's no subjectivity, there's no meaning, there's no purpose, there are no goals that we act toward, blah blah blah, no free will, etc., then there's no point of doing philosophy. And I don't think that's true at all. I think philosophy has a very important role in today's society, probably more so now than ever. And philosophy and critical thinking is hugely important, because things are getting crazy right now, aren't they? And say what you want about that, but I guess why materialism doesn't work is a very big topic, and there are people who have done that very well. But just to keep a long story short, I'll leave you with a pragmatic approach to that. Go out and try to live according to materialism, scientific or philosophical materialism. Go out and try to act as if you don't have a mind, as if everything is nature rather than nurture. What you're going to get there is determinism, that everything is predetermined, and that you don't have to take responsibility for anything in your life. And that could lead you down a very dark path, to keep a long story short. And also, it's going to produce something that many of the new atheists and the materialists, especially in the public sphere, aren't going to like very much. And it's that you're not allowed to take credit for anything. If you don't have a mind and you don't have free will and everything's predetermined, then you're not allowed to take credit for anything. And trust me, those new atheists and materialist scientists out there who are sort of the faces of science and atheism, Richard Dawkins, Chris Hitchens, Neil deGrasse Tyson, just to name a few, those guys are so damn arrogant they don't want to not be able to take credit for anything. It's not humbling to them. It would burn them up inside. They would absolutely implode. They would have no meaning or purpose in their life. That would be the point, that they realize that they're nothing. You know, Lawrence Krauss has, that talk. Why is there something rather than nothing? And it's humbling to know that you're just a speck in the universe and that you mean nothing. It's like, really? Try to act as if you actually believe that and see what happens. And I'll leave you with that right there. On the ontology and existence of God. Okay, so yeah, it is an important issue. I'm not saying it's not important at all. But in order to argue about the ontology or existence of God, one must know something about its nature. You don't have to understand its fundamental being necessarily, like in a deeply philosophical sense. That's why those things are still up for debate, right? But we can discover something about its nature based on usage from a pragmatic point of view. How do we use God as a tool to, as a moral framework to better yourself, to face the unknown, to pit good against evil, and try to allow good to win out in your life, and that'll come down to free will. And we can discuss the science. We can discuss science in the same way. It's through usage that we understand something about the nature of science. Obviously, the nature of science in itself is something that philosophers are still debating to this day to a very large extent. Some of them rightly, and some of them seem to miss some big issues on the topic. But it's through usage that we understand, as much as we can about, as much as we do about science. And that can be good, which means we would be using it as a tool to better ourselves and better society, but not better ourselves in the same way that morals better ourselves, in more of a physiological way, of course, in a more material way, empirical way. Or it can be bad, just like religion can be. It can delve into dogma, and materialists pretty much are on that boat, and new atheists too, for that matter. So it's through usage. It's through a pragmatic approach to something that we can determine whether it's good or evil, right? Or good or bad or whatever. So there was another part of the comment about atheism not being a belief system, as atheism being simply a reactive position to theism and the problems with theism. But I'm still not convinced that atheists understand the real problems with theism. And I think I'll tell you right now, I think the problems with theism boil down to the individual. There are no systems that are in and of themselves bad or corrupt or evil. That's a human trait, to be bad or corrupt or evil. It's a trait of something or someone who has free will to be good or bad or poor or evil or whatever. So, yeah, it's kind of just to miss the point. It's like if you, let's see, if you take atheism as a purely reactive position and not as a point of view, so to speak, or a belief structure, that's to do so without regard to the values that religion has ingrained in us and in our culture. And religion has set the substructure for Western society, in fact. Look at Western Judeo-Christian cultures. They tend to be the least corrupt on average. They have their fair share of problems, of course, but they tend to be the least corrupt and the least violent and least insane cultures in the world, And then we've seen in the 20th century what happens when you try to build a purely secular society. Everyone dies. That's what fascist Germany was. That's what the Soviet Union was. That's what Maoist China was. Over 100 million people died as a result of secular thinking, because Nietzsche, well, when Nietzsche announced the death of God, he was worried that, people would, well, they've taken the moral substructure out from under themselves, out from under their culture, and so they wouldn't know how to act, they wouldn't know how to live. But I think he wrongly thought that humans would be able to create new values on their own, secular values, and well, that's what the Soviets and the Maoists did in China, and we saw the result of that. So. Anyway, so atheism only becomes proactive when it decides to project fault onto the system itself rather than to individuals. So it's to miss the whole point about individuality, which is what Western society is based on, and is what Christianity and Western religions are based on. That you have an individual choice to do good or evil, and if you do good, then you'll be rewarded, and generally you are. And to do bad, you won't get away with it, generally speaking. And there's even a doctrine in the East that will agree with that, and that is the concept of karma. If you make the wrong moral decisions, you're not going to get away with it, and generally you don't. And it doesn't really pain me to say this, but like I grew up in Louisiana, not far from New Orleans, and when Katrina hit, I didn't really feel sorry for anyone. Maybe a few individuals, but I didn't feel sorry for New Orleans on the whole. I didn't pray for New Orleans. I didn't, look, this was the problem. The hurricane didn't cause the levees to break. Corruption caused the levees to break, and that's what flood myths are all about. It was a typical flood myth. Things get corrupt enough, which they were and still are in Louisiana. Louisiana is the most politically corrupt state in the Union. God will send a flood. That's the idea. You don't have to attribute that to God, the guy in the sky. That's not what God is, really. But two questions arise whenever something like that happens. Something in nature, something that so many people perceive to be horrible, but really it was the results, directly or indirectly, of humans being careless or reckless or immoral, and which Louisiana certainly is. All of those things. New Orleans in particular. I mean, Jesus Christ, man, it's sin fucking city, Two questions arise there. It's first, why did this happen? And don't attribute it to nature. Don't attribute it to anything other than yourself and your own poor decisions. Take responsibility for it, And then the second question is, what are you going to do about it so that it doesn't happen again? And that means act better, on every level of analysis that you possibly can. Make yourself better first. You have your own problems to fix. Don't go fuck up someone else's life, if yours is fucked up already, You can't help anyone if you can't help yourself, truly, So help yourself, and then help your friends and family, and then help your community, and then help the world if you want to. If you get to that point, because it's difficult to get to the point where you straighten everything out in your own life, in your immediate circle, So that's what religion is really about, But atheists tend to punish the whole class because a couple kids are misbehaving, and those couple kids are the fundamentalists. And yeah, the fundamentalists are crazy and radical and don't know what the hell they're talking about. No one should say otherwise, But the reality is that this concept of good versus evil is a real thing, and it's very, very old. It's been around as long as humans have existed and have had language and been drawing pictures, painting pictures on cave walls. And so it depends what you do with it, and it comes down to your free will as to whether or not something is good or evil, especially a structure like religion. and look, science, again, science can be viewed as good or evil in that regard too. You know, you can either cure disease or make an atom bomb. And even then, curing diseases isn't always a morally good thing either, depending on how you manage that. And making an atom bomb isn't always a bad thing, depending on how you manage that, too, right? It'll always be a bad thing on some level of analysis, just like curing disease will always be a good thing on some level of analysis, but you know what I mean, right? So good versus evil is an undeniable reality, and it lies at the bottom of all religious narratives. It's embodied in all religious narratives, universally, cross-culturally, everywhere. So also one thing that atheists like to do is punish the whole class because a couple kids are misbehaving, in terms of like that universal cross-religious idea as well, because Islam is so, corrupt and produces so much violence. Well, it's a religion, and Christianity's a religion, and it shares some things in common. So Christianity must be a huge problem too. And so the atheists tend to just lump all of the religions together and call them bad. Well, it's easy to rid yourself of responsibility. But, is it true? I'm not buying it. So maybe I'll do a follow-up depending on how the response is to this, but I think this video is probably a lot better than the last. So tell me what you think, because I actually took notes this time. Yeah. So tell me what you think in the comments below, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.